Today is Sunday, July 2nd, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. You can probably hear that I'm out for a walk for the first time in a long time because I've been stuck in the office doing all of our year-end accounting work and all that stuff, and with that finally finished up, I'm free to get back to ordinary life, and thankfully I was able to get all that done before the 4th of July, and I'm happy to get a chance to post a walk talk today. And I have a very interesting topic that I'd like to introduce you to. Some of you may be familiar with it already, but I think most of the folks who listen to these talks will find this new and very interesting, although it may be found very disturbing. I have a weekly tutoring meeting with an adult who is not a Christian, and we're studying through Aristotle's logical works together, and as we go through them, we discuss current events that relate to the topics that come up in our study. As you know, I'm a Catholic classicist, but this man that I meet with, like I said, he's not a Catholic, and he has a background in computers and information and investing. We come from two very different backgrounds, but I'm amazed every week by the quality of our conversations. In fact, though we schedule a 1-hour Zoom meeting, we often spend over 2 hours talking because the discussions are so interesting. And I assume he agrees because he keeps coming back. But as I said, we're discussing and studying through Aristotle's categories, but we're talking about how the ideas that were taught by Aristotle relate to things like computer programming, artificial intelligence, and so on. And there are many very interesting discussions, usually raised by him because he works in these modern, or has a background in these modern applications. And he's trying to understand what the ancients taught about these topics, because we can see in modern society that there are problems, and these problems are obviously connected to philosophical issues. And so going back and trying to figure out what's actually wrong is a challenging study, and one that he very impressively has really invested himself in. The talk begins with consideration of what's going on in modern society with computers and things like that. And he knows I work in education, obviously, so we talk about the relationship between developing technology and education. We agree on many things, but once in a while we find an important point that we disagree on. And what's interesting to both of us is how technology is challenging our ideas about education. And what's been interesting about our conversations is that things that we've been studying and discussing in our Dominican chapter often end up being the topics that he just happens to raise in our weekly discussions. So it just seems strangely providential in my life to have these discussions. So one week, for example, at our Dominican chapter meeting, we have a lecture by our spiritual director when we get together. We study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles together. And he was talking about St. Thomas's teaching on play. And what's interesting about play, and what it is that play is something that we engage in for its own sake. In fact, we rarely ever engage in anything for its own sake unless we consider it to be like play. And that's why we have sayings like, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. Even your professional activity will be like play. Play is something we do for the sake of pleasure, and we do it for its own sake. And that's not an evil thing, that's just a human thing. And St. Thomas talks about it with reference, I think I remember it was in reference to a proverb that mentioned wisdom playing in the beginning of creation. I think that was the context. So what we're talking about is how computers and technology are changing life and changing education, and what the purpose of education even is, as this technology makes things available to children that were never available to children in the past. If we look at the history of the world, we often see it divided into three periods. The ancient world, which is really thousands and thousands of years, almost the entirety of human history, we refer to it as the agricultural age. And then in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we have what's called the industrial age. Major revolution in every aspect of human life. And then after the industrial age, in the late 1990s, we have what's called the information age. And we've been living in this information age, and the question is, what comes next? What's going to come after the information age? Now, I'm not saying these things as a Christian. I'm not saying these things as if these are things that God has said should happen. I'm saying these things as one simply observing history and asking, regardless of what should or should not happen, what seems to be happening? And this is where my discussions with this man spend most of our time. What's happening and what's coming? Where is this stuff going? And he's interested in this because, as I said, he's an investor. So his work is always trying to predict what's next. And as I said, we have some very interesting discussions. And this past week, I have to admit, I spent most of the time listening as he explained an idea relating to the imagination age. And what he believes, and what I'm learning many others who work in technology believe, is that the next great age after the information age is going to be the imagination age. And this is what I wanted to talk about in today's walk. I'd like to share with you, if you're not familiar with it, I'd like to share with you what I've been able to learn from these discussions about the imagination age, because it's very interesting stuff. If we look at the progress through history in these different ages, we see the agricultural age was an age of physical labor, where the labor was done primarily by men and animals. We could just say animal labor, with men included as animals. The agricultural age was an age in which man worked directly with the natural world. He either did work himself or he made use of animals and some simple tools to do the work, which was primarily agricultural. It might be better to call it the manual age. And then with the scientific revolution, the advent of democracy, the development of technology, man was challenged to consider whether there might be a better way to live and work. And what was proposed is what we now think of as the industrial age. The establishment of great industrial cities, the connection of these cities by water routes and by trains for the most part, the development of factories, assembly lines, and then as technology continued to develop with electricity arriving, of machinery, electrically powered machinery after gas-powered equipment was developed. And so instead of man working directly with the natural world, man began to work with machines. And the machines carried out the labor rather than men or animals. The labor of man was transferred to the machines. And man, as a species, began to physically work less. And I've talked about this in the past because the statistics are quite surprising. There's a book on farming written in the early 1900s by a man named Gardner. I think his name was Frank Gardner. And it was sort of a complete manual of every aspect of farming, both plant and animal. And I think it was the introduction to that book, he explained that in the late 1800s, I think the number was something like 90% of Americans lived on farms. 90%. So when we talk about early America, we often don't remember to include the fact that early America was an agricultural society. And I believe he said that 90% of Americans lived on farms in the 1800s. And then by 1900 or so, that number was down to like 50% and ended up down around 30% by the time that book had been written. So you see this radical change in American life. And I know from my own family history that my own grandparents moved from rural West Virginia to suburban New Jersey in the 1940s or so. So my own grandparents were part of that move from agricultural life. In fact, I still have a picture of my grandfather when he was probably 10 years old on his family farm. But they moved to suburban central New Jersey and began working in factories. And that was part of the industrial age. men began working with machines. In fact, my grandfather was an electrical motor builder and repairman. So we see that transition from heavy outdoor physical labor to less physical indoor labor with the assistance of machinery and different forms of power, whether it's gas or electricity. And this was the industrial age. And we have that century before computers really began to develop. And then we moved from the industrial age to the information age, where many processes of the industrial age were automated and began to be managed by computers. So rather than even having men working at machines or with machines, the computers began to run the machines. The machine work was automated because of the development of computer technology. And then the internet developed, and much of local business moved online. Just about anyone who had a business, who owned a business, turned to the internet as the way that they would advertise their business, share information about their business, connect with potential customers, manage transactions, keep records, and so on. We moved from the farm to the factory to the desk. And as we look at this development through the ages, we find man becoming less and less engaged with physical labor. Human labor, or I should say human physical labor, continues to decrease as technology and automation increase. And so now we're left with this information age, and all kinds of movements and developments happen corollary to this information age. For example, the feminist movement really begins to fly because the work that needs to be done no longer demands the greater physical strength of a male body. There was no feminism in the agricultural age. There was hardly any feminism in the industrial age. But in the information age, there really isn't much of an advantage for a working man over a working woman. And so you can see all of these different things that develop socially relate to this underlying movement. Some call it progress of technology, which continually diminishes the need for human labor. We can see the same thing in the military, where warfare has transitioned so much from physically rigorous hand-to-hand fighting of men in the trenches, as it were, to high-tech military operations. Let's say something like the Air Force. Think of what a drastic influence the development of Air Force technology brought to warfare, how much it changed things. And then think of missiles And then add to that the benefits of computers and GPS. And now, if you're paying attention to the war in Ukraine, you find that most of the activity is unmanned. They're using drones and missiles to carry out most of the activity. And so this opens the question, well, why can't women be soldiers if the soldiers are sitting in remote places with video game controllers flying drones around and just entering coordinates to launch missiles that can strike a target the size of a quarter? Surely women can do that stuff. And so you see these social developments really seem to follow these economic and technological developments. And now, in 2023, this just continues to get even crazier and crazier as automation reaches more and more industries. And as we get to this current generation, and we now have the advent of artificial intelligence, we're left asking the question, what are men really supposed to be doing? Is human work, is physical work really human work? After all, horses can pull plows, donkeys can turn mills, different animals can do different things. We don't need men to do those things, and computers can do even more. Computers and machines can handle most human work. And now with artificial intelligence, the ability to automate human tasks is going to become exponentially greater. If more and more is automated and human labor is less and less necessary, what should men actually be doing? Is this development revealing man's true end and purpose? That man actually isn't a laborer, but that man, get ready for this, man, rather than being a laborer, is actually a gamer. What if play is actually man's real work? This is the question of the present age. And again, remember I said before, I'm not saying that this is necessarily Christian. As I'm going to explain later, I don't believe this is Christian, but this is what's happening. This is how people engaged in these industries and markets think about what's happening in our generation. They believe that the real unique capability of human beings, which separates them apart from all other creatures and things, is actually gaming. And of course, when we think of gaming, we may think of some silly video games, but that's really not the point. And this man that I talk with, he told me a story about the chess player Bobby Fischer. And he said that this chess player, Bobby Fischer, who is supposedly the world's master chess player, he got to a point, and I don't know this story exactly, I'm just paraphrasing what I remember from our conversation. He said this chess player, Bobby Fischer, got to a point where he had the game of chess mastered. And when he had come to this place where he had mastered the game of chess, he realized that this game, while it is considered to be intellectually challenging to most people, can be automated. The game can be automated, and therefore it's no longer challenging. In fact, he lost interest in it. And he realized that once a game is mastered, we lose interest in it, because this reveals what it is about the game that actually interests us. And the key word that was used was the challenge of foresight. The challenge of foresight. What actually arouses us and causes us to take pleasure in a game is the need to try to predict what our opponent is going to do. And we talk about chess like this. We say the benefit of chess is it teaches you to think 3 or 4 steps ahead, to calculate the consequences of different moves, and you can see how that kind of thinking is helpful in life, and therefore chess is recommended to develop this power of calculation or foresight. But when we get to the point where the game is mastered, the foresight no longer challenges us and we lose interest in the game. It's why adults don't like to play kids' games, because they're too easy. And what we want in the game is to have some challenge of decision making based on predictions about what's going to happen. And so this game theory suggests that foresight is actually man's ultimate strength, and this is what man wants to do. He wants to engage in this foresight. And as his work becomes more and more automated, and the need for physical human labor, even for reasoning, becomes less and less, man's work can be replaced by computers and machines, and man, as a race, will be free from physical labor. And this is why politicians are talking about universal basic income. And this isn't some crazy theory that I'm talking about. There are politicians who already are talking about this, who are proposing this idea of universal basic income. And the idea is that if technology can automate the work that needs to be done so that the production of the goods that we need no longer require human labor, we can simply distribute the wealth generated by this automation and free men to do other things. That being a hard worker really isn't a human virtue, because work is really not the essential human activity. And so then the question is, well, what would happen if there was some kind of universal basic income where people shared the wealth generated by technology and were free to pursue other things other than work? What if man was no longer a worker, but one who plays? What would man actually do? And we talked about how the purpose of schooling throughout American history has been to develop what? To develop workers. And we're becoming increasingly frustrated with modern education because modern education is not equipping students for life in the modern world. It was designed during the industrial age, which is already over, And much of what we're doing now in the information age is not even the focus of the education that kids are receiving, especially in public schools. For example, I can agree with this because in my work in website development and online publishing, the rules for online writing are almost the opposite of what I was taught in school as a writer. When I was in school, I was taught that I should write and I should vary my vocabulary. I should try to challenge myself and use more advanced vocabulary, avoid common terms, avoid repeating expressions, and so on. And with online writing, the exact opposite of that is what makes for effective writing. Because in online communication, in digital communication, search engines control everything. And in order to get your writing to appear in a search engine, you've got to write in a way that recognizes what's called search engine optimization, or SEO. Because you've got to write in a certain way that will be rewarded by the search engines. You've got to write with the main keyword phrase that you're trying to succeed in on Google, for example. You've got to have that keyword phrase repeated throughout your writing. You've got to use low-level vocabulary intentionally, because Google will actually read your essay and index your essay, and if you use complex language, it'll cause the search engine to struggle, or it'll be too complex for people to read on their phone, which is how half of the people access most of the online content. And so you've got to rethink everything, because the means by which we communicate have changed. And so everything that I see my kids being taught in college, I'm doing the opposite in my actual work, writing and publishing online. They're not being prepared for how things actually work in the information age. They're being taught principles of writing that were established during the industrial age. So you can see these things get very interesting. It's like asking whether kids should learn cursive handwriting because mommy remembers learning to write in cursive when she was in second grade. Yeah, in 1980. We also didn't have computers at home in 1980. We also didn't have printers at home. We also didn't have wireless mobile phones. We wrote in cursive on paper for a reason. And those reasons have all changed. And so you can just see how we get into these very interesting dilemmas as we consider the fact that technology continues to advance, and the implications of that development are very serious. It really determines how we should study, what we should study, and for what purpose we should study. But the theory in modern society, in secular society, the theory is that man is going to be freed from the need to work. And play is going to become the occupation of man. And what's going to be rewarded in society is imagination. Imagination is what is actually going to be most valuable. Not the ability to do physical work, not the ability to reason, but the ability to imagine new things. And that's why the next age is said to be the imagination age. And remember, this is not a Christian idea, so there's all kinds of different parts to this so-called imagination age. For example, you'll notice the promotion of drugs like marijuana or mushrooms and psychedelics. This is being promoted because these might possibly help us to move forward in the so-called imagination age. You can say, well, marijuana or psychedelics negatively affects one's ability to work and reason, and the people of the future say, who cares about that stuff? We don't have to work or reason anymore. We have to imagine. Artificial intelligence also relates to this information age, because if you think about technology like the printing press had a function, and the function of the printing press was simply to copy, to reproduce, or to clone what already existed. So if someone writes a book, we simply take that text and use technology to copy it exactly as it was written. But now, with digital media and with artificial intelligence, we don't need to copy or clone. We can publish an infinite number of revisions, an infinite number of variations. So there can be a book written by a particular author, but that book can be instantaneously revised and published in 1,000 different versions, so that no one really reads the same book. Wouldn't that be interesting? Because again, what's valuable is not whether or not you perform what was done in the past, or whether or not you say what was said in the past, but whether it's imaginative, whether it's new, whether it's interesting, whether it's pleasurable, and so on. And if we think, what's really interesting to me is if we think back through our lives, we can see that this kind of stuff has been teasing us all along. I remember when I was in maybe 4th grade, so that would have been around 1985, there was a series of books in the school library that my friends and I were all obsessed with. And I wasn't a book reader. I don't even think I read these books, but they were interesting. It was a series called Choose Your Own Adventure. And what was unique about these books was, rather than reading a book from beginning to end and learning a story, the book would give the reader options at different points in the story. So you'd get to a key point in the story, and it would say, to do this, continue reading. To do this, turn to page 64. And so as you read, you could actually choose how the story would go. You could choose your own adventure. And we found that interesting. We found that more interesting than just reading a story. We like the idea of it constantly changing. Imagine how interesting it would be to turn on a movie, and again, if you think back in the past, a movie was simply a copy of a movie. You got a copy and watched it at home. Or if it was on television, it was simply a copy of the one version of the movie. But what would happen if every time the movie played, artificial intelligence rewrote the story and presented the story with differences, with changes? And if you watched it again 10 minutes after it finished, artificial intelligence could present the same movie, but with new changes, with different turns of events in the story. And this could go on almost infinitely because of artificial intelligence and the computer's power to do this work. Because after all, the movies now are no longer copied onto a disc or a cassette tape. They exist in a digital format that can simply be revised constantly. Imagine if you could watch Lord of the Rings and in the middle of the story, Gollum died, or Sam died, or Frodo lost the ring and Gollum took it back into the caves. What if the stories were just always rewritten? We could watch the same movie. It's bad enough as it is with a good movie. You can watch it 20 times, but imagine if there were always slight changes. You could possibly watch it even more. And this is what's so addictive about the video games that are available today. It's high-tech, choose-your-own-adventure. Because the kids and men, not just kids, I should just say the people playing games, and these are high-tech, powerful video games which are going to become even crazier when artificial intelligence gets involved. It's infinitely more interesting than watching a movie because you control the movie. You control the story. And that's what's so interesting about the video games. It's never the same. You can have one game and play it again and again and again and again and again, and you can make it different every time. And so the challenge of the game, again, or what I should say, what limits the pleasure received from the game is your own imagination. And it's this power of imagination that appears to be the skill that's emerging as the most marketable skill for the coming generations. And this is why it's called the imagination age. And the argument is that, again, if man is freed from labor by technology and is even freed from the need to write, because artificial intelligence can now take care of that, and men are already using artificial intelligence to replace writing in simple forms today, like writing advertisements or writing legal documents. Artificial intelligence is already being used for simple work like that. As this continues to develop, man's not going to need to write. He's not going to need to work. He's going to be left to play, and the virtue of that age of play is going to be the imagination. And again, to tie this back to what I mentioned before, that's why there's rising interest in things like the use of psychedelic drugs, because if imagination is the goal, drugs can certainly help one to be more imaginative than a person who's not hallucinating and having all kinds of strange visions as a result of drug use. This is also related to all the stuff that we hear about virtual reality. There's no more need to own land because the land is farmed by machines and computers. So why even bother to own the land when the land is no longer the means of earning a living? When I was a kid, it was important to have a store on Main Street or in the mall because you had to get into a place where there was lots of foot traffic. Well, Amazon destroyed all that. Now, all you need is a website and some diligent marketing. But now even that's being replaced by artificial intelligence. And so man's going to be left with all of this technology and nothing to do except play. And play is going to be man's work. And the virtue that's going to allow a man to succeed in play is going to be imagination. So there's this idea of where things are going. And as I said, this is what ties together so many of these different movements in our society. Like, you look at this transgender movement and you're like, what in the world's going on here? These wackos with blue hair, tattoos all over their bodies, using drugs, making up names for themselves, identifying as other genders, identifying as animals. What the heck's going on with all this stuff? Well, when you understand these ideas of this imagination age, it all makes sense. What's going on with all this wackiness with video games just becoming more and more realistic, if that even makes any sense? The development of virtual reality. I don't know if you noticed, but Apple just came out with a new virtual reality headset. That's sort of the future of communication. Cost like $3,500. But is a headset that you wear that allows you to just do things by hand gestures and things like that. Then you've got Elon Musk working on Neuralink, which can actually supposedly link our brains to this technology. When you consider all of these different things that are developing, they can only be understood if you grant this argument that the next age of human life is going to be an imagination age where everything is virtual, everything is digital. It doesn't matter if you have 10 acres of fertile farmland, because a place in the metaverse, which is for sale, by the way, might be more valuable. People used to laugh 10 years ago when we found out that people were playing a game called Farmville, where on Farmville you spend real cash to purchase virtual animals in Farmville, and you get with your friends and you can compare each other's farms and compete against each other, and when you consider that what we normally compete for is status, well, if status can be gained in the virtual world, it's just as real, quote unquote, as status in the physical world. So why wouldn't you invest and buy some virtual real estate in the metaverse? After all, if there's 4 million people active on the metaverse today, how is it any different from owning a storefront in the mall? And so you see, this virtual reality starts to get very interesting. And it's argued that this is where things are going. Now, again, just to repeat, I'm not saying that this is a Christian idea. I'm not saying that this is a good thing. Hey, let's get on board the imagination age. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is how people are thinking about these things that are going on. This is how people are investing in what's going on. And as we were having this discussion, and it's all tied into evolution and science, they're all part of one massive movement. This isn't something new. It's simply the next phase of this scientific revolution, all related to evolutionary theory and so on. But the idea is that man is going to be freed from physical labor. Computers and machines are going to do all the work that's necessary. And man is going to be left free to play. Now, this is where, in our discussion, I raised my objection. And I said, this is where Christian thinking and this modern thinking fundamentally disagree. Because all of this talk about freeing men from labor, freeing men from all of this toil and work so that they could just be free, it's all optimistic. It all is based on an idea that man is intrinsically good, or I should say innately good, and that he's ruined by these things, by work. The need to work, the pressure to work, the burden of work is what has made man evil. And the idea is that if man could just be freed from the need to work, his innate goodness would be revealed. This is, again, the thinking behind all of the talk about defunding the police. All of this stuff we see going on with stores being looted and destroyed. If you listen, for example, to the mayor of Chicago, he'll explain that this is not crime. These are people being forced by our society to these desperate measures. And therefore, if we could just do away with all of this trouble that's caused by human work and could provide people with what they need, with technology basically becoming a sort of virtual class of slaves, let the machines and the computers be our slaves and we can all be free. The idea is that man will all be good and that the imagination age will be an age of peace because man is good, man is good, man is good. And so this whole philosophy has as its origin this heresy, a denial of original sin. And so I raise my objection at this point and say, all of this assumes that man left to himself is good. And that's simply false. And we can demonstrate that that is false. This is why we argue that it's dangerous to spoil children. And what does it mean to spoil children? It means to leave them idle, or to give them things that they don't appreciate and don't deserve to have, can't use rightly because they can't appreciate the value or understand the purpose of those things. That's what it means to spoil a child. So we're basically arguing that if we just spoil all the children, then all the children will be good. And this underlying idea is at the root of everything that we see in this generation. How did homosexuality become good? Oh, very simple. There was one simple argument. Homosexuality is natural, and whatever is natural is good. Therefore, homosexuality is good. And Christians who think that way themselves, because they've imbibed this heresy of human nature, they really didn't have anything to say against it, because they use that argument in their own life all the time. That's how their schools are organized. That's how their parenting methods are directed. That's how their schools are directed. That's how their school curriculum has been directed. They've already swallowed this camel, denying human nature. And so when the homosexuals come along and make the same argument, they say, that's a pretty good argument. What am I going to do? Deny it and turn my whole life upside down? Nah, I'll just grant it and mind my own business. And the same thing is happening with transgenderism, except transgenderism takes it to a new level and combines it with this imagination age craziness. And again, because the Christians have already swallowed down all of this imagination age stuff in 1,000 different ways, because they just love science and they love talking about how Catholics actually invented modern science and Catholics are responsible for modern science. Just clueless nonsense talk. But they've already married themselves, or I should say handcuffed themselves, to modern science, even to the point where Christians are arguing to defend the theory of evolution. They've already got themselves entangled with these ideas. And now that these ideas advance, there's no way for them to get out of them. And so we see Christians just continually justifying, admitting more and more craziness, because they've been trying to befriend all of these innovations for decades and decades. And now the real nature and end of these innovations is beginning to come to fruition, and the Christians find themselves marching in the gay parades, just out of their mind, crazy. And it's because they allowed themselves to wander from this fundamental Christian teaching of original sin. Work is actually good for man because he is corrupt by nature. If we look at the lives of the saints, let's say Saint Benedict, His motto was ora et labora. And he didn't say that man should pray and work because he just couldn't think of anything beyond physical labor. It was because he knew that physical labor was essential to the moral happiness of man. Man needs to keep himself engaged with good work because idle hands are the devil's workplace. And yet this idleness has now become the normal environment in which men live. And rather than say that this is evil, our society is actually rushing towards it so that man becomes even more idle. And we now call idleness good. And we can talk about this for hours because it just begins to tie everything together that we've seen and experienced and objected to. Think about the whole retirement culture where people neglecting the needs of their kids, sending their kids off into adult life unprepared and unprovided for, while they hoard money in retirement savings accounts for this dream of being free to be idle. Jesus actually teaches the parable of the man who built bigger barns for himself. We can see that as we get into this discussion, these issues have been dealt with. These issues have been discussed throughout sacred scripture in the lives of the saints, through revelations that have been given to saints. Like my wife, we were just talking about this recently, and she was sharing with me all kinds of stuff from the dialogue of St. Catherine of Siena that relates to these issues of work and idleness. But we can see, I believe, we can see where this modern secular society is heading and how it really stands in direct opposition to Catholic society, and yet, in a way, it's deceiving because it seems to say that man's spiritual life or his imagination is actually more important than his body. And that seems to sound Christianish. But what's behind this, first of all, is a fallacy relating to the nature of man, which is an easy error to spot if we're paying attention. But there's another, I think, even more important issue. And it has to do with this idea of evolution, which Christians have stupidly embraced. But this idea of evolution suggests that we really don't know what man is because he still hasn't been revealed. He's changing constantly, and anything that's changing is imperfect. And therefore, if man has not yet been perfected, we don't even know what man is. And just think how stupid it is to talk about the evolution of man when Christ came into the world 2,000 years ago, and we all now have to confess that Christ became a man, but he became an imperfect man because man in the future will be more perfectly developed than Christ was when he became a man way back 2,000 years ago. The theory of evolution causes all kinds of a mess when we think about the incarnation, which is a pillar of Christian faith and of salvation. But even more important than that, when we talk about these things, we talk to these modern people with these ideas about how society is advancing and progressing and changing, and all of these new things are emerging, and man is realizing this new purpose and this new power and all of these different things. There's one other essential point that I raised in this discussion. And it's the fact that a Catholic believes that man and the world were created by a person, namely God. That they were created by His will, by His design, and for His own pleasure. They only exist to do His will. And therefore, if His will is simple, and if His will is known to the ancient world, it simply needs to be duplicated in each generation. It doesn't need to be revised. It doesn't need to be innovated and changed. His will doesn't evolve and become different with each generation. The idea that the world and man, most importantly, were created by God for a specific purpose is the ultimate truth that just demolishes any suggestion that man is moving into some new phase or some new age or some new capacity or some new realization of his potential. All of that talk assumes that there is no creator, that there is no plan for man, and that God's will is not known. I would argue the opposite. I would argue that God created man for a very specific purpose. God revealed His will to man, and it is a matter of simply reproducing that will in every generation. Imitating the saints, imitating Christ, which is the whole point of the Christian life, to imitate a historical person, to try to duplicate his life. By this we know that we know God, that we walk as He walked. That's a paraphrase of, I believe it's one of John's epistles, 1 John. We know that we've come to perfection when we are like Christ. The perfection of man took place 2,000 years ago. The perfection of man is not something that's yet to come. And yet at the same time, this is sort of a counterfeit of the resurrection, because man is going to change. Man is going to become perfect in glory in the future, but it's because he's going to be recreated, resurrected, and remade, and fit for eternal life. But that's related to the resurrection. It's not something that's going to be realized on earth as a result of biological or natural evolution. And so what I'd like you to see and think about and talk about, at least with me, is all of this stuff we see in current events, on the news, and so on. How does it relate to these fundamental heresies, namely denying that God is the creator of the world, denying that God's will for man is already known, and denying that man is by nature evil, corrupt as a result of original sin, and in need of redemption? That man left to himself does not do good, but rather does evil. As you watch the news and listen to current events, think about how simply they relate to the very first line of the Creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Do we actually believe that? Do we actually believe that the heaven and the earth and everything in the earth were made by God, and more importantly, that they are God's private property to do His will? Or do we believe that everything is developing and changing and progressing and evolving, and who even knows what the future is going to be like? Man's destiny has yet to be revealed. That all assumes that the heavens and earth were not created by God for a specific purpose that God Himself has revealed. And to say that man, by being freed from labor, by being freed from work, and just left free to roam the streets like we see in the cities today, welfare man, when man is given what he needs without the need to work for it, he becomes better? Really? Is there any evidence where that has proven to be true? We see the opposite. We see the opposite. We see the most virtuous men are the men most inclined to work and reason, and the men freed from work often become the most miserable and sinful. And if the evidence suggests the opposite of what this theory proposes, why in the world are we pursuing this as if something different is going to happen? So anyway, my goal for this talk was to simply get you thinking about this idea of the imagination age, because maybe this will help us to discern the times a little better as we try to deal with the craziness that's going on around us, and in our work of evangelization, maybe help us to get right to the crucial issues when we talk to people about these things, which really just bring us back, I would say, to talk about the creed, to go back to something as simple as the Apostles' Creed. And when we get into discussions about these things, go back to the Apostles' Creed. So before you get into a discussion about gender changes and all this kind of craziness, maybe we should get back and discuss whether the person believes in God the Father Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth. And if they say no, then that's where we need to stop. Because if we can't agree on that, why are we talking about abortion? Why are we talking about genders? Why are we talking about video games or anything else? If we can't establish the very first article of faith, because I think that Christians have been washed way downstream and we're lost in useless discussions, useless political controversies, rather than focusing on the articles of faith and praying that as we share these things and teach the creed to unbelievers, that God would give them the grace of faith to receive it as the Word of God. Because if we can lead someone to faith and start them in the creed, all of these other issues downstream will be taken care of. I hope that's helpful. God bless.